Alright guys, just finished up, came out of the Shostakovich 5. I'll finish off the story for you, but kind of need a second right now to take a breather and catch up on this, because that's really kind of a speechless feeling you get after something so profound as Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony. I think there's a lot of ambiguity to the piece, and it's really difficult to know exactly what the composer was saying with it, but it's really just makes you pause when you understand the full story behind it. And I think something that I kind of realized tonight is, as classical musicians, we haven't been doing the best job of educating our audiences. The reason I say that is, at the end of the symphony, I left off telling you about the third movement, where it was basically so sad that people wept openly at the performance. And this was a big deal in 1936, 1937, because the people in Russia were actually literally, if someone came and took your family member, the very next day you could not show any remorse. You could not weep openly. You could not grieve publicly. You couldn't even really have a funeral or anything like that. They just disappeared, and you were supposed to act like nothing happened because you're in a utopia, a man-made utopia. And for everybody to start weeping during the third movement, you kind of like had this collective grief, this final permission to actually feel and to have that freedom. And then the fourth movement launches, and this is the part that I think a lot of people still don't quite understand what Shostakovich was doing, and there's a few reasons for it. Part of it's because the score kind of got, it's not entirely clear if the score was published or if it was purposefully published with this, but at the end of any symphony, like I said, since Beethoven, you get used to having a heroic journey. And in the fourth movement, this is when you get your triumphant finale. The hero is going to finally gain victory over whatever he's been wrestling with this entire, sometimes hour-long symphony. And we start to get what we expect in the fourth movement of Shostakovich's symphony. But at the very, very end, when the piece should be its most triumphant, when the piece should be, it's most victorious sounding, and this is the moment that would have been intended to appease Stalin, should he attend the premiere. We get this big march, and there's a few odd things that Shostakovich does in that march. Number one is the tempo is really weird. Usually it would be really fast and upbeat. The tempo would actually kind of keep increasing, get faster, until boom, 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 and you end on a nice big major chord. But Shostakovich doesn't do that. He actually makes it very clear that the tempo is supposed to stay the same, and it's actually very slow for a finale. And it sounds very forced. In his memoirs, which some people don't believe that he actually penned his memoirs. Some people think they're forged. Other people think they really are his own writings. But whether or not they're true, that's a different story. What he wrote in his memoirs, supposedly, is that the end of the Fifth Symphony is supposed to sound like someone is beating you with a stick, telling you to repeat. It's something along the lines of, I will rejoice, I will rejoice. And you go along muttering to yourself, I will rejoice, I will rejoice. But it's been beaten into you. And that's exactly what's happening at the end of this symphony. But there's a few things that I never really noticed or realized until I heard it live tonight. There's a couple other really odd things. At the very end, usually a symphony ends on the chord or the tonic, the first chord from the scale. So remember, this is the Symphony number 5 in D major. So in the key of D major, a D major chord is the chord we should land on, and that's how we know we're at the end, because we've begun, the symphony is in D minor. So the symphony starts in D minor at the very beginning in the first movement, But at the very end, in the fourth movement, we should expect it to end on D major, if in fact this symphony is a triumphant symphony, the hero has gained victory. That's what we would expect. It starts in D minor, but ends on a nice big D major chord. What happens in Shostakovich's symphony, though, is really interesting, because at the very end, the last chord isn't even technically a chord at all. In order to have a chord, we need 3 different notes. So in the case of D major or D minor, we would need the notes D, F something, and I'll explain that in a second. So we would need D on the bottom, F something, and then an A on top of that, okay? Now, if it's a minor chord, we're going to have D, F natural, and then A natural. Okay, and that makes it sad and minor. That's how the symphony begins, with the F natural. But in order to turn it major, we take that F natural and we raise it up 1 note, and we turn it into an F sharp. And suddenly the chord's going to sound nice and major, nice and happy, nice and triumphant. So we need 3 notes in order to know what kind of chord it is. You know, that middle note, that's what determines whether or not it's minor or major. Well, across this whole symphony, we've been having this battle between basically that middle note. Is it going to be minor? Is it going to be major? Is it going to land on minor? Is it going to land on major? Up to this point, it kept landing on minor, kept landing on minor all throughout the symphony. It just always seems to land on minor. At the very end, the very final chord, we should expect D major. Shostakovich does something very interesting. All he plays are Ds, just the note D stacked on top of itself. And we don't get that middle note at the very end. To the ear, to the ear that's not listening very closely, it still sounds pretty triumphant, but to a trained ear, you'll recognize, and it's very clear when you're hearing this symphony performed live, you can feel it. You can feel there's something missing. You can feel how hollow the harmony sounds on the final chord, and it just kind of gets held out. And like I said, it's not even technically a chord because we don't get that middle note. There's no F sharp or F natural to tell us if it's a minor key or a major key, if the symphony has ended triumphantly, or if the symphony has ended in tragedy. It's just totally ambiguous. And I personally think that's Shostakovich's way of still getting back at Stalin and kind of being like, oh, you think you can force me to write a symphony the way you want, Stalin. I'm going to write the symphony the way I want still. You just won't realize it. Like I said, to the untrained ear, this isn't as clear. But then there's another thing, too, that I noticed that was really striking hearing the symphony live. Shostakovich is known for being an incredible orchestrator, and in addition to being an incredible orchestrator, being able to color his music with all the different timbres and instruments of the orchestra, he's also known for being an incredible percussion writer. He's actually kind of one of the first composers to write extended pieces of music for just like full-on percussion battery, full-on percussion ensemble. And at the very, very end of this symphony, right when that ambiguous D chord thing is getting played, the chord kind of cuts out for a second, and you just hear the bass drum, and it's just like boom, boom, boom. Because remember, this march, it should be fast, but it's actually going really slow, and it's really weird, and it's just this boom, 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 and you can feel it thudding against your chest. And to me, it really just sounds like this nail getting pounded into the coffin. It's just a really, really kind of brutal gesture at the end. You've really got to be listening closely, and you've really got to know what you're listening for, because it's easy to think that, this is a really cool, this is a big triumphant moment, and it's just like the music's just slowing down. You could assume that. And I think that's why I'm going back to it's important for us classical musicians to get better at educating our audiences, because the musicians all did a fantastic job tonight. However, I think a lot of us as audience didn't quite understand what happened, because at the very, very end of this symphony, after you've heard this really honestly tragic ending, this tragic ending in disguise, I should say. It's a disguised tragic ending.
Can we stay focused on the task at hand?
I think we should have taken a moment and paused and had some silence and reflected on how real life the story that symphony was telling, how real life that story was. At one point, Stalin literally signed just essentially a waiver, a quota of 300,000 deaths. Got to fill the quota, was essentially what he was saying. And this was a real time that happened in history. This was the real aftermath, the real effects of a socialist system, and a philosophy of statesmanship that descended from naturalism, and a view that the only thing humans are essentially just
the last to accept it on
pieces of matter, randomly, that happen, by happenstance we happen to be here. But there's that logic really takes you down a staircase where meaning starts to lose its meaning and purpose starts to lose its purpose, and at the end of the day, all you have left to live for is a power struggle. And there's hardly anything more powerful than deception, especially deception of the masses, convincing the masses to buy into a narrative where they are the ones who are essentially the downtrodden, the ones who are being oppressed. And in the case of Soviet Russia, that narrative was used to actually oppress everybody in the long run. What's really interesting is hope seems to find a way. Everywhere you look in history, during times of extreme oppression, all the way back to the Pharaoh oppressing the Israelites, up through Hitler oppressing the Jews, all throughout time, hope seems to break through somehow. And I think it's a really interesting question. Where is this hope coming from? Why does hope seem to always break through in the human story? And I think that's really what Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony starts to get at. There's a lot of ambiguity, but for some reason this symphony has already stood the time of 80 years, getting close to 100 years, and I think it's our duty as classical musicians, it's our duty as classical audiences to keep this story alive, to reflect on it, ruminate on it, to heed its warnings, and to realize that something like this could be closer than we think. When we connect with art and we resonate on a human level with someone else, Shostakovich has been dead for decades now, but somehow we still connected with him tonight. That makes the world a little bit smaller. That makes it a little bit clearer the common human element we all share. And I think it would be a shame if we were to lose out, if we were to forget the warning that he's left for us in his Fifth Symphony, along with a lot of other things, but it's chock full of so much more. So I hope you guys found this series of videos interesting. Sorry I kept having it cut. We just kept having intermissions and that sort of thing. If you guys are interested in learning more about the piece, I'll actually link a really cool documentary underneath this video. If you enjoyed this content, make sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell on this video so that you can keep up to date as I do more concerts and teachings and all sorts of stuff to unlock the meaning of classical music, because I think the meaning, when we have the meaning, it just makes life more meaningful. So if you guys have any questions,